To the outside world, the grand facade of Buckingham Palace represents the pinnacle of British history, a symbol of continuity, elegance, and unwavering duty. It is a fortress of limestone and gold, guarded by men in bearskin caps and steeped in traditions that have survived centuries of war and political upheaval. But for a young woman named Charlotte Briggs, who stepped through those gilded gates in 1996, the reality behind the stone walls was not a fairy tale of royal service. It was a descent into a surreal and terrifying ordeal, a psychological landscape dominated by the erratic and often cruel whims of a man who demanded absolute subservience. Working for Prince Andrew was not merely a difficult job, it was an experience that one former maid could only describe as bordering on torture, a relentless exercise in humiliation that left permanent scars on her memories of what should have been the most exciting time of her life. Charlotte was only 21 years old when she arrived in London, fresh from Yorkshire and brimming with a kind of optimistic energy that defines youth. She had secured a position within the most famous household in the world, a seemingly golden opportunity that promised a front-row seat to history. For the first 6 months, the sheen of the palace held true. The corridors whispered with the footsteps of world leaders, and the sense of occasion was palpable. Her competence and dedication were quickly noticed, leading to a promotion that, on paper, looked like a significant step up the ladder of royal service. She was asked to become the personal maid to the Queen's second son, Prince Andrew. However, beneath the prestige of the title lay a dark truth that Charlotte was too new and too naive to understand immediately. There was a reason this coveted position was vacant. Within the insular, gossiping community of the palace staff, the role was viewed not as a promotion, but as a sentence. The Duke of York had already cultivated a notorious reputation among the household staff. While the public saw a war hero who had served in the Falklands, the domestic staff saw a man prone to explosive tantrums and what they politely termed sweary outbursts. The warning signs were there, whispered in the servants' quarters and exchanged in knowing glances, but Charlotte, eager to prove herself and possessing a sturdy Yorkshire resilience, believed she could handle the challenge. She uprooted her entire life, moving her belongings into the palace and committing herself to the role. It was a decision she would come to regret almost immediately, as the reality of her new master's temperament crashed down upon her. The environment Andrew cultivated was one of high-stakes anxiety, where the punishment for minor infractions was disproportionate and often deeply personal. One of the most degrading recurring nightmares for Charlotte involved a task so trivial it defied logic, yet it became a defining symbol of her mistreatment. It was a nightly ritual that underscored the vast chasm between the prince's entitlement and the dignity of his staff. Andrew would frequently be sitting in his office, settled in a chair right next to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows. Despite being within arm's reach of the heavy drapes, he would not close them himself. Instead, he would summon the command chain. He would call down from his office, his voice echoing through the intercom, demanding that a maid be sent up immediately to shut the curtains. For Charlotte, this meant abandoning whatever task she was currently handling and beginning the arduous trek up 4 steep flights of stairs. The sheer physical exertion required to sprint up the narrow servant staircases, breathless and anxious, was merely the prelude to the humiliation. Upon arriving in the office, panting and trying to maintain her composure, she would find him sitting exactly where he had been when he called, mere inches from the fabric he refused to touch. He would watch as she wrestled with the heavy drapes, towering as high as a house, ensuring the room was sealed from the night. On one particular evening, the absurdity of the task turned into abuse. In her haste, or perhaps due to the sheer weight of the material, Charlotte left a tiny, almost imperceptible gap between the curtains. It was a sliver of darkness, nothing more. But for Andrew, it was an unforgivable failure. He saw the gap and erupted. He didn't just correct her, he screamed at her in the corridor, his voice booming with a vitriol that shattered her composure. He unleashed a torrent of profanity, demanding to know if she could do anything right, belittling her intelligence and her capability in a single breath. There she stood, a 21-year-old girl with little life experience, being verbally flayed by a 40-year-old man, a prince of the realm, simply because he could not be bothered to reach out his hand and fix a curtain. The injustice was suffocating. She was left standing in the corridor, tears streaming down her face, grappling with the shock that a man who had piloted helicopters in a war zone was seemingly incapable of basic tasks, preferring instead to use his staff as outlets for his inexplicable rage. But the curtain incidents, as demoralizing as they were only the beginning of the surreal existence Charlotte had entered. If the shouting was frightening, the silent, obsessive demands were perhaps even more disturbing. Prince Andrew, a grown man in his late 30s, maintained a collection of 72 stuffed animals. These were not kept in storage or displayed on a shelf. They were arranged on his bed, and the specifics of their arrangement were treated with the gravity of a military operation. When Charlotte took over the role, she didn't just receive a handover of keys and schedules. She was subjected to a full day of training dedicated entirely to the positioning of these teddy bears. The absurdity of the situation was compounded by the tools provided. Charlotte was given a laminated diagram, a literal map of the bed, detailing exactly where each plush toy was to reside. It was a bizarre hierarchy of soft toys. The bears dressed as sailors had their specific coordinates. The hippos and the other animals had to be placed with mathematical precision. This was not a charming eccentricity. It was a trap. The arrangement of the bears was a daily test, a way to catch the staff out. If a single teddy was out of place, if a sailor bear was listing to the left or a hippo was too far forward, Andrew would lose his temper. He would shout and scream at whoever was responsible, treating the misalignment of a stuffed animal as a dereliction of duty. Every single day, the ritual had to be performed. Charlotte had to carefully remove all 72 animals at night to turn down the bed, placing them in their designated holding areas. Then, every morning, she had to reconstruct the display, consulting the mental map and the training she had received, terrified that a slip of the hand might trigger another explosion of rage. She described the ritual as peculiar and utterly ridiculous, a sentiment that hardly captures the psychological toll of fearing a grown man's wrath over a teddy bear. It was a mechanism of control, a way of enforcing his dominance over the minutiae of his environment and the people who maintained it. This culture of fear was not limited to Charlotte or her specific duties. It permeated the entire household. The staff lived in a state of constant, low-level terror, knowing that dismissal could come at any moment for reasons that were entirely arbitrary and often cruel. There was an unspoken punishment system, a capriciousness that made security of tenure impossible. Charlotte watched as colleagues were picked off for physical attributes or minor sartorial choices. One aide was fired simply because Andrew did not like the look of a mole on the man's face. It was a dismissal based on vanity and a complete lack of empathy. Another staff member was let go for the crime of wearing a nylon tie instead of silk, a snobbish distinction that cost a person their livelihood. Perhaps most chilling was the footman who was dismissed because Andrew found his voice irritating. These were not firings based on incompetence or negligence. They were the whims of a tyrant who viewed his staff not as human beings, but as furniture that could be discarded if it didn't suit his aesthetic or mood. The degradation extended to daily interactions. The protocol of bowing was weaponized. If a staff member entered a room and forgot to bow, or perhaps didn't bow deeply enough, Andrew would not simply reprimand them. He would engage in a humiliating piece of theater. He would leave the room, re-enter, and force the staff member to try again, repeating the entrance until he was satisfied with their performance of subservience. It was a game of power, designed to remind everyone in his orbit of their inferiority. The daily humiliations were endless and exhausted the spirit. The attention to detail required to avoid a tantrum was maddening.